I love to sing, and I love women.
On Christmas Day, 1995, Dean Martin died at his Beverly Hills home. He wasn't forgotten. His children were still out there. Frank Sinatra was still alive, and the world still knew every word to That's Amore. But in another sense, Dean had been alone for years. Everything changed in March 1987 when his son, Dean Paul Martin, was killed in a jet crash in the California mountains. Those closest to Dean said something inside him disappeared that day. His daughter, Deanna, remembered how difficult the loss was for him, while friends described it as a major turning point.
Women and song. Wine. I'm not too crazy about wine.
The man who had spent decades convincing audiences that life was effortless suddenly seemed to lose his spark. Dean had traveled an extraordinary distance from Steubenville, Ohio. Born Dino Paul Crocetti in 1917, the son of an Italian immigrant barber, he dropped out of school at 16, dealt cards, bootlegged liquor, boxed under the name Kid Crochet, and sang in local clubs before becoming Dean Martin. But behind the famous smile were 3 marriages that revealed different versions of him. Betty McDonald knew Dean before fame. She raised 4 children while he struggled to build a career, only to watch him leave once success finally arrived. Jeanne Biegger, a former beauty queen, spent 24 years married to the king of cool. They raised 3 children together, but even a ranch and golf course couldn't keep Dean close. Their marriage eventually ended in divorce. Then came Catherine Hawn. Their glamorous wedding featured white doves and flowers flown in from France, but the marriage lasted only 3 years. Each woman loved a different Dean Martin, yet none seemed able to fully reach the private man behind the performer. This is the story of those 3 women, the family behind the legend, and the devastating loss that changed Dean forever.
Oh, I drink, but I'm not a boozer, not an alcoholic or anything like that.
His story began far from Hollywood in the steel and smoke town of Steubenville, Ohio. Dino Paul Crocetti was born there on June 7, 1917, above his father Gaetano's barbershop. Gaetano had arrived from Italy with almost nothing, building a modest life one haircut at a time. Dean's mother, Angela, was Italian-American, and Italian was the language of their home. Dino spoke an Abruzzese dialect before English, which he didn't begin learning until he entered school at 5. At Grant Elementary, classmates mocked his accent. The experience left him deeply self-conscious about his voice, an extraordinary irony for a boy who would eventually become famous because of it. His daughter, Deanna, later described his childhood as centered around Steubenville's close Italian community, bocce games, swimming in the Ohio River, Sunday church, and his father's barbershop. But beneath that neighborhood warmth was a tougher world. By Dean's teenage years, Steubenville had become known as a wide-open town filled with gambling, bookmaking, and bootlegged liquor.
I'm not lazy. They want to think I'm lazy, but they know I work.
Steelworkers finishing exhausting shifts brought money into pool halls, cigar stores, and backroom casinos. Dean fit naturally into that environment. He dropped out of Steubenville High School in the 10th grade, later joking that he believed he was smarter than his teachers. Whatever his academic ability, Dean possessed something more useful on those streets. He could read people, calculate odds, and hide exactly what he was thinking. He briefly worked at a steel mill, delivered bootleg whiskey, and dealt blackjack in backroom gambling rooms. Then, around 15, he entered the boxing ring. Calling himself Kid Crochet, Dean fought as a welterweight. Friends nicknamed him Punchy after he was reportedly knocked down almost immediately in his first fight. Still, he continued, fighting dozens of bouts and collecting injuries along the way, a broken nose, damaged knuckles, a split lip, and an injured finger. But boxing was never going to become his future. Music was already pulling him somewhere else. Dean had sung Italian songs around his family for years before becoming fascinated with popular music, especially Bing Crosby.
I mean, could I be where I am today if I were lazy and if I were a boozer.
Between hands at the gambling tables, he would sit in the back room listening to Crosby on the radio. Dean began singing with local bands under the name Dino Martini, inspired partly by Italian tenor Nino Martini. By the late 1930s, he was performing with the Ernie Mackay Orchestra and later Sammy Watkins, gaining valuable experience on real stages. Watkins eventually suggested a new name. Dino Martini sounded too ethnic for American booking agents. Dean Martin was simpler, cleaner, and easier to sell. Dino accepted it, unknowingly creating the identity he would carry for the rest of his life. By the early 1940s, Dean was performing in New York clubs and appearing on radio. He was young, frequently broke, but already developing the relaxed charm that would become his trademark. He had also met his first wife, Betty McDonald. Then Jerry Lewis changed everything. By 1949, Martin and Lewis were becoming one of America's hottest comedy acts. They had radio, television appearances, sold-out nightclub performances, and a Paramount movie contract. Their formula looked effortless. Dean would begin a song, calm and perfectly controlled. Jerry would interrupt and create chaos. Dean would react like a man forced to tolerate the world's most exhausting child, and audiences exploded with laughter. What people often missed was how important Dean was to the comedy itself.
And the only reason I worked is to provide for my family. And
Jerry received attention for his wild physical humor, while Dean was dismissed as the handsome straight man. But Dean's timing provided the foundation. Jerry's jokes worked because Dean knew exactly when to react, when to wait, and when to say nothing. Making that skill invisible was part of Dean's genius. Between 1949 and 1956, Martin and Lewis made 16 films together, including My Friend Irma, At War with the Army, Scared Stiff, The Caddy, and Artists and Models. Their movies became enormous business, transforming Dean from an Ohio nightclub singer into one of America's most recognizable entertainers. But success came with a cost. His marriage to Betty ended in 1949, and Dean married Jeanne Biegger that same year. Jeanne understood exactly who she was marrying. She knew Dean had been married when their relationship began, and she understood the temptations surrounding a rapidly rising Hollywood star. Jeanne entered Dean's world, knowing exactly what she was getting into, and for years their arrangement seemed to work. They had 3 children together: Dean Paul, known as Dino Jr., Ricci, and Gina. Of them all, Dino Jr. seemed to hold a special place in his father's heart. Friends described him as Dean's golden boy, a child in whom Dean recognized something of himself. But by the mid-1950s, Dean was increasingly moving through family life rather than truly living inside it.
when I work, it's serious work. And the serious work that I do, I try to have a little fun with it.
Movies, radio, television, and nightclub appearances consumed his schedule. Jeanne managed the home, raised the children, and handled the responsibilities that came with being married to a major star. Meanwhile, distance quietly grew between them. Dean's drinking was part of his public image, but not entirely an invention. He preferred lively rooms, late nights, and places where he could entertain. He loved his family, but domestic life never seemed as natural to him as performing. Then, in 1956, his partnership with Jerry Lewis collapsed. Hollywood predicted disaster. Many believed Jerry was the real talent and Dean merely the handsome straight man standing beside him. Dean proved them wrong. His solo recording career exploded with hits including Memories Are Made of This and later Everybody Loves Somebody. He starred opposite John Wayne in Rio Bravo, demonstrating that he could succeed dramatically without Lewis. And when Frank Sinatra gathered the Rat Pack around Ocean's 11, Dean was no longer anyone's supporting player.
I wouldn't change one thing. Not one thing.
By 1960, the king of cool had arrived. The character seemed effortless, relaxed, amused, slightly drunk, and never appearing to take anything seriously. But Jeanne understood how carefully that image was maintained. She had already spent more than a decade living behind it. Before becoming Jeanne Martin, she had been Dorothy Jeanne Biegger, a young beauty queen from Coral Gables, Florida. In 1948, at 20 years old, she attended a Martin and Lewis performance in Miami and met Dean afterward. She knew immediately that he came with complications. He was married, already had children, traveled constantly, and possessed the dangerous kind of charm that made everyone feel special. Still, Jeanne chose him. For much of the 1950s, that choice appeared to have paid off. Dean was becoming enormously wealthy and famous. The family had a beautiful Beverly Hills home, children, status, and seemingly everything success could provide. From the outside, Jeanne Martin appeared to have everything. Her children were healthy, the family looked perfect in magazines, and Jeanne herself was elegant, composed, and exactly what Hollywood expected from the wife of a major star. Behind that image, she was holding the family together largely on her own. Dean genuinely loved his children, but his demanding schedule kept him away. He had an extraordinary ability to make strangers feel like old friends, yet maintaining that same closeness at home seemed far more difficult. There were also other women. Dean's reputation as a ladies' man wasn't simply publicity. Jeanne apparently knew about his infidelities and for years tolerated them. In that era, many Hollywood marriages survived through exactly that kind of silent arrangement. But by the late 1960s, the arrangement was collapsing. Dean's career had become even bigger. The Dean Martin Show began in 1965 and attracted enormous audiences. He was also making Matt Helm movies, recording music, performing in Las Vegas, and maintaining the carefree, rat-pack lifestyle. There seemed to be no off switch. Then Catherine Hawn entered his life. Jeanne reportedly discovered the relationship gradually, noticing the subtle changes that become obvious after spending 2 decades with someone. In December 1969, she announced that she was filing for divorce, publicly identifying Dean's relationship with Catherine as the reason. But before finally giving up, Jeanne made one extraordinary attempt to save the marriage. She purchased Hidden Valley Ranch near Thousand Oaks, complete with a golf course. According to their son, Richie, Jeanne hoped that giving Dean somewhere to play golf at home might finally make him spend more time there. It didn't work. The divorce stretched on for 4 years, becoming one of Hollywood's most expensive celebrity separations of its era. When negotiations finally approached their conclusion, Dean reportedly gave his lawyers a simple instruction: give Jeanne whatever she wanted. After more than 2 decades together, the woman who had raised their family, tolerated his absences, endured his affairs, and even bought him a golf course to bring him home, was finally walking away. Jeanne's divorce settlement reportedly included $6.5 million in cash, the Beverly Hills family home, cars, and other assets, an enormous fortune for the early 1970s. Afterward, Jeanne quietly continued raising the family. She never remarried and remained close to Dean's relatives. When she died in 2016 at 89, she had outlived Dean by more than 20 years. In later interviews, she spoke about their marriage with warmth rather than bitterness. She had loved Dean, but she also understood exactly who he was. Dean, meanwhile, was already preparing to marry again. Catherine Hawn was around 25 when she entered his life. She worked as a receptionist at a Beverly Hills beauty salon and had none of the Hollywood credentials people might have expected from Dean Martin's next wife. They reportedly met while Dean was still legally married to Jeanne. By the early 1970s, their relationship was public. On April 25, 1973, only weeks after Dean's divorce was finalized, he married Catherine at his Beverly Hills home. The wedding was spectacular. Reportedly costing around $100,000, it featured flowers flown from France, 22 cages of white doves, and a guest list filled with Hollywood royalty, including Frank Sinatra. But behind the extravagance was a complicated reality. Dean was 55. Catherine was decades younger. He had spent much of his adult life surrounded by capable women who maintained the family while he performed, traveled, and lived inside the world of celebrity. Catherine offered something different: youth, warmth, and a relationship without decades of accumulated disappointment. Dean also adopted Catherine's daughter, Sasha, bringing her into the Martin family. But once the flowers disappeared and the celebration ended, the differences between Dean and Catherine became harder to ignore. His world had been built over decades around Las Vegas, Hollywood, the Rat Pack, and friendships filled with private jokes and shared history. Catherine had entered that world almost overnight. Their problems didn't explode into immediate public scandal. Instead, the marriage began wearing down quietly as two people separated by 30 years of age and completely different life experiences discovered that attraction wasn't necessarily enough to build a lasting home. Catherine had never truly belonged to Dean's world. She had grown up watching him on television like millions of other Americans, and suddenly she was married to the man behind the image. By 1973, Dean's famous drinking persona was also becoming less of an act. Alcohol had become a regular part of his life, sometimes making him warm and sociable, other times distant. His demanding schedule kept him away for long stretches, making an already difficult marriage even harder. More importantly, Dean expected relationships to require few questions. He preferred comfortable silence and emotional distance. Jeanne had learned to live with that over decades. Catherine hadn't. By 1975, their marriage was struggling. In 1976, Dean filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. They had lasted only 3 years. There were no biological children together, although Dean had adopted Catherine's daughter, Sasha. Importantly, the divorce didn't change that relationship legally. Sasha remained his adopted daughter. Afterward, Catherine did something unusual for someone who had married one of America's biggest celebrities. She disappeared from public life. There was no entertainment career, tell-all memoir, or endless series of interviews about living with the King of Cool. Catherine raised Sasha and largely stepped away from the spotlight. Dean never married again. By his late 50s, he had 3 failed marriages behind him, 8 children connected to his complicated family life, and decades of fame that had somehow left him increasingly isolated. For the first time, Dean seemed genuinely alone rather than merely playing the detached character audiences loved. The drink remained, the familiar grin remained, the jokes remained. But something underneath them was changing. Still, Dean had no idea that the greatest heartbreak of his life was yet to come. 11 years later, in March 1987, tragedy would arrive without warning from the California sky and take the son who occupied a special place in Dean's heart. After that day, friends and family would say the Dean Martin they had known never completely returned. And everything that had come before, the marriages, divorces, fame, drinking, and loneliness, would suddenly seem small compared with what he was about to lose. By 1972, Dean Martin and Catherine Hawn were openly together. On April 25, 1973, only weeks after his divorce from Jeanne was finalized, Dean married Catherine at his Beverly Hills home. The wedding was enormous. Reportedly costing around $100,000, it featured flowers flown from France, 22 cages of white doves, and a guest list packed with Hollywood royalty. Frank Sinatra attended, along with figures from Dean's famous Rat Pack circle. But behind the spectacle were 2 people separated by 30 years and completely different lives. Dean was 55 and had spent decades being supported by women who managed the domestic responsibilities he often avoided. Catherine was 25, with a young daughter named Sasha, whom Dean later adopted. For Catherine, marrying Dean meant entering a world she had previously only watched from a distance. Dean belonged to old Hollywood, Las Vegas, and friendships stretching back decades. Catherine had grown up watching him on television. Once the wedding excitement faded, those differences became increasingly difficult to ignore. Dean was still working constantly. His drinking had also become more than the carefully constructed stage image audiences recognized. At home, he could alternate between warmth and emotional distance. And Dean wasn't a man who enjoyed explaining himself. His preferred relationship was one where few questions were asked and silence remained comfortable. Jeanne had spent decades learning how to navigate that personality. Catherine had entered the marriage without that history. Before long, their silences stopped feeling comfortable. By 1975, the marriage was in serious trouble. In early 1976, Dean filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. After only 3 years, his third marriage was over. They had no biological children together, although Dean's adoption of Sasha remained intact. Catherine received a settlement and then did something surprisingly rare in Hollywood. She stepped away. Rather than turning her marriage into a career, memoir, or series of television appearances, Catherine largely disappeared from public life. After the divorce, Catherine Hawn quietly raised Sasha, whose adoption by Dean remained intact. She didn't pursue entertainment, write a memoir, or turn her marriage into publicity. She simply stepped away from Hollywood. Dean was 58 when his third marriage ended, and he never married again. He had 3 ex-wives, 8 children, and a Beverly Hills home where he would spend much of his remaining life increasingly alone. The familiar glass and grin remained, but friends noticed something changing behind them. Yet Dean's greatest heartbreak was still 11 years away. Dean Paul Martin Jr. had been flying since 16, earning his pilot's license at an age when most teenagers were learning to drive. Flying became one of his greatest passions. Known as Dino Jr., he had inherited his father's looks and natural charm, but friends described him as warmer and more comfortable with people away from the spotlight. Growing up as Dean Martin's son came with enormous privilege, but also pressure. By the time Dino Jr. was old enough to understand his father's fame, Dean was already the king of cool, a Rat Pack icon seen by millions on television. Dino Jr. nevertheless created an identity of his own. At 13, he formed Dino, Desi, and Billy with Desi Arnaz Jr. and Billy Hinchy. The group scored 2 Billboard Top 30 hits in 1965. His famous name certainly opened doors, but Dino understood that reality without pretending otherwise. He also pursued acting, earning a Golden Globe nomination for Players, and later appearing in the television series Misfits of Science. His personal life included marriages to actress Olivia Hussey and Olympic figure skating champion Dorothy Hamill. But beneath the music and acting was something much more serious. In 1980, Dino joined the California Air National Guard. He eventually became a captain in the 196th Tactical Fighter Squadron. For Dean Martin, this wasn't simply another successful child following him into entertainment. Dino Jr. had built something entirely his own. He was a musician, actor, father, military officer, and experienced pilot. The son Dean looked at with unmistakable pride. And in March 1987, the passion that had defined Dino Jr. since he was 16 would lead to the tragedy that Dean Martin never truly recovered from. Dean Paul Martin Jr. flew F-4 Phantom fighter jets, combat aircraft requiring exceptional skill and nerve. At 35, he was a respected captain in the California Air National Guard, proud of an achievement that belonged entirely to him rather than his famous name. On March 21, 1987, Dean Paul took off with Weapons Systems Officer Captain Ramon Ortiz for a routine training mission over California's San Bernardino Mountains. Then the weather deteriorated. A snowstorm reduced visibility dramatically. Controllers attempted to redirect the aircraft, but the F-4 continued into dangerous conditions. Investigators later considered spatial disorientation in the whiteout as a possible factor. The jet struck San Gorgonio Mountain at tremendous speed. Both men were killed instantly. Severe weather and difficult terrain prevented search crews from reaching the wreckage for days. Dean Martin received the news by telephone. Those around him never fully described that private moment. What they remembered instead was the man who emerged afterward. Dean handled the arrangements and endured the funeral with the same public composure he had perfected over decades. Frank Sinatra and longtime friends offered condolences. These were people who had watched Dino Jr. grow from a child into a successful man. Then Dean went home, and according to those closest to him, something fundamental had changed. His daughter Dina later described how difficult the loss was for him. Friend Paul Anka called it a major turning point. Others who encountered Dean during his final years remembered a man who still smiled and treated people kindly, but seemed to have lost the energy behind that familiar warmth. For decades, Dean had made effortlessness into an art form. The relaxed eyes, the drink, the smile, the impression that nothing could ever disturb him. It was one of entertainment's greatest performances. After his son's death, he could still perform it. He simply seemed to have lost the reason. Dean was 69 years old. He had children, 3 former wives, famous friends, enormous wealth, and a Beverly Hills home. Yet increasingly, he chose solitude. During his final years, Dean often ate alone at a familiar Italian restaurant on La Cienega Boulevard. The staff knew him and understood that he didn't want attention. When fans approached, he remained gracious, giving them the Dean Martin they remembered before quietly returning to his dinner. Then he went home. His world became smaller. He watched television, played golf with a limited circle of friends, and spoke with his children. The man who had spent half a century entertaining packed rooms increasingly withdrew from public life. For someone whose existence had been defined by audiences, that withdrawal said more than any interview could. Dean Martin had spent his career making millions of people believe everything was fine. After losing Dino Jr., he no longer seemed interested in convincing himself. Dean Martin largely stopped performing, recording, and giving interviews. The man once watched by millions every week simply withdrew from the machinery of fame. Frank Sinatra tried to bring him back. In 1988, Sinatra organized the Together Again tour with Dean and Sammy Davis Jr., intended as a final Rat Pack reunion. Dean agreed, but after only a handful of performances, he left the tour. Health problems were given as the official explanation, but those around him believed there was more to it. After losing his son, performing Carefree Happiness simply didn't come as naturally anymore. Dean withdrew, and Sinatra and Sammy continued with Liza Minnelli taking his place. Then another loss arrived. Sammy Davis Jr. died in 1990. Dean attended the funeral with Sinatra, the 2 surviving members of the famous circle sitting together as they said goodbye to another piece of their shared past. Meanwhile, Dean's own health was deteriorating. Decades of smoking had contributed to emphysema. His breathing became increasingly difficult. He lost weight, and the physical decline became impossible to hide. Yet Dean faced it with the same lack of drama that had defined his public personality. During these years, Jeanne remained close. Their marriage had ended long before, but she had known Dean since before the height of his fame and understood him in a way few people could. She called and visited while his children also became increasingly present. Dean had spent much of their childhoods working and traveling. Now, as his world grew smaller, family returned to the center of it. On December 25, 1995, Dean Martin died at his Beverly Hills home. He was 78. The cause was acute respiratory failure. Christmas Day was an almost strangely cinematic ending for a man whose life had unfolded beneath spotlights. Frank Sinatra was devastated. He later described Dean as a brother and said the world would never be the same without him. Las Vegas dimmed its lights in Dean's honor. He was buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles, and his headstone carried the title of one of his most famous songs, "Everybody Loves Somebody Sometime." But Dean left behind more than records, movies, television shows, and the mythology of the Rat Pack. He also left behind the women who had known very different versions of him. Betty McDonald, his first wife, had loved him before the fame and raised 4 of his children. She survived him by several years, dying in 2002. Jeanne Biegger, the woman who spent more than 2 decades beside Dean during his greatest years of success, lived until 2016. Each had experienced a different chapter of Dean Martin's life, and each understood something audiences never completely could. Behind the King of Cool was a far more complicated man. Jeanne had bought Dean a ranch with a golf course, hoping it might bring him home, only to watch him leave anyway. After more than 2 decades of marriage, she walked away with a substantial settlement and a broken heart she never turned into a public spectacle. In her later years, those who knew her described a woman who had made peace with the life she had lived. Catherine Hawn disappeared into privacy after their 3-year marriage. She raised Sasha, the daughter Dean had adopted, and rarely spoke publicly about her famous former husband. And Dean Paul, his golden boy, remained forever 35, the son whose death changed everything. Look at the full journey. Dean Martin began as Dino Crocetti, the barber's son from Steubenville who struggled with English, dropped out of school, delivered bootleg whiskey, dealt cards, boxed for small purses, and sang wherever someone would listen. Then he transformed himself into one of America's greatest entertainers. He became the King of Cool, married 3 women, raised a complicated family of 8 children, conquered movies, television, music, and Las Vegas, and made millions believe that nothing in life could ever bother him. That was the great Dean Martin illusion. He made everything look easy. The drink, the sleepy eyes, the effortless smile, the feeling that nothing mattered enough to worry about. It was all part of the performance. But behind it was a far more complicated man, a husband who struggled to stay, a father who loved imperfectly, and eventually a grieving parent who never fully recovered from losing his son. Perhaps that is what makes Dean Martin's story so haunting. The ease was the performance, the grief was real. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling me what you think Dean Martin was really like behind the King of Cool persona. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.